September 11th, 2001. A date seared into American consciousness for reasons the entire world knows. But in the small town of Spencer, New York, that date marks a different kind of tragedy, a more personal horror that would be overshadowed by national catastrophe, buried beneath the weight of a country in mourning. In the early morning hours of September 11th, 2001, Michele Harris drove home from her job as a waitress. She pulled into the driveway of the home she still technically shared with her estranged husband. Her car was found there the next morning, keys in the ignition, purse inside. The driver's door was open. Michele was gone. Not missing in the conventional sense, not at first. Her husband, Calvin Harris, told people she'd left, walked away from her children, from her life, from everything. Just disappeared into the night by choice. And for a few critical hours while the Twin Towers fell and America stopped breathing, Michele Harris's disappearance was barely a blip on anyone's radar. But there was blood in that driveway. Not much. Easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. And the more investigators looked at Calvin Harris's story, the less sense it made. 23 years later, Michele Harris's body has never been found, but her estranged husband has been tried for her murder 3 times, convicted twice, acquitted once. The case has twisted through the legal system in ways that seem impossible, creating a maze of contradictions where the evidence points one direction but the conclusions keep changing. How does a woman vanish from her own driveway in a small town where everyone knows everyone? How does a case with no body result in 2 murder convictions and 1 acquittal of the same man? And why, after more than 2 decades, does no one know where Michele Harris is? WHO, Michele Ann Zaccanino was born on January 12, 1961. To understand who she became, you have to understand where she came from. She grew up in upstate New York, in the kind of small-town environment where families have deep roots, and everyone's business is known, discussed, and remembered. Those who knew Michele in her younger years describe her as vivacious. That's the word that comes up repeatedly. Not just happy or outgoing, but vivacious, full of life. The kind of person who lit up a room, who made people feel seen and heard, who had energy that seemed boundless. She was social, genuinely interested in people, the type who remembered details about your life and asked about them later. Michele had dark hair that she wore in styles popular in the 80s and 90s, and a smile that made it into every photograph. She wasn't movie star beautiful, but she had something better: warmth. The kind of face that made people trust her, confide in her, want to be around her. In her early 20s, Michele met Calvin Harris. Cal, as he was known, was a local guy from Spencer, a tiny town in Tioga County. Spencer is the kind of place where farming and small business are the lifeblood, where families stay for generations. Cal came from one of those families. The Harrises had been in Spencer for a long time. They had land, a used car dealership, roots that went deep into the community. Cal was different from Michele in temperament. Where she was outgoing and social, he was more reserved, more focused on business and practical matters. But opposites attract, or so the saying goes, and in the early years, they seemed to balance each other. They married and began building a life together. Michele and Cal had 4 children, 4 kids in relatively quick succession, which meant Michelle's 20s and early 30s were consumed by motherhood. Anyone who's raised children knows the all-encompassing nature of that work. The exhaustion, the joy, the way your identity becomes entangled with being someone's mother until you sometimes forget who you were before. But Michele never lost herself entirely. Even with 4 children, even with the demands of being a wife and mother in a small town, she maintained her own personality. Friends remember her as devoted to her kids, but also as someone who still laughed, still went out occasionally, still maintained connections to the world beyond her family. She worked as a waitress at a local restaurant called the Village Tavern. Service industry work is hard. It's physically demanding, the hours are often brutal, and you're dealing with the public at their worst and best. But Michele was apparently good at it. Customers liked her. She was friendly, efficient, remembered regulars' orders. It wasn't just a job to her. It was social interaction, a chance to be Michele and not just Cal's wife or the kid's mom. By the late 1990s, cracks were forming in the Harris marriage. This is important to understand. The breakdown wasn't sudden. It wasn't one catastrophic event. It was a slow erosion, the kind that happens in marriages all the time. Communication breaks down, resentments build, people change or realize they want different things. Michele wanted out. She began the process of separation, which in upstate New York in the late 90s meant entering a complicated legal and emotional minefield. Divorce in small towns is never just a legal proceeding. It's a public event. It affects social circles, business relationships, family dynamics. And when there are 4 children involved, the stakes become astronomical. The divorce was contentious. This is documented fact, not speculation. There were disputes over custody, over property, over money. Cal Harris had assets, the car dealership, land, savings. Michele wanted her share, wanted to ensure her children were provided for. Cal, according to court documents and testimony from those who knew them, did not want to give her anything without a fight. Friends of Michele from this period describe a woman under stress but determined. She was fighting for her independence, for her future, for her right to leave a marriage that wasn't working. But she was also scared. This is crucial. Multiple people who knew Michele in 2001 later testified that she had expressed fear of Cal. Not constant terror, but an underlying anxiety about how he would react to the divorce, what he might do if pushed too far. In the summer and fall of 2001, Michele was living separately from Cal, but the divorce wasn't finalized. She was staying with friends, sometimes in her car when she couldn't find a place. This was a woman in transition, in a vulnerable position, trying to keep her life together while the ground shifted beneath her feet. Her children were her center. Despite the chaos of the separation, despite the financial and emotional strain, Michele remained focused on her kids. She saw them regularly, fought for custody, wanted to create a stable life for them once the divorce was complete. This matters because one of the narratives that would emerge after her disappearance was that Michele had abandoned her children. Anyone who knew her rejected this completely. Michele would not have walked away from those kids. Not voluntarily. Not ever. The world around them. Spencer, New York, is a town of barely 2,000 people. When people describe it, they use words like rural, quiet, close-knit. It's in Tioga County in the southern tier of New York State, that band of small towns and farmland that stretches across the state's southern border. This is not suburban New York. This is not even small city New York. This is rural America in its most traditional form. Wide open spaces. Farms that have been in the same families for generations. Main streets with a few businesses, everyone knowing everyone else's name, history, and business. In this environment, the Harris family was prominent. Cal's family had the car dealership. They had property. They were known, respected in certain circles. This mattered enormously in what was to come because in small towns, local influence can shape everything from how investigations are conducted to how juries perceive defendants. The year 2001 in rural New York was a time of economic uncertainty for many families. Manufacturing jobs were disappearing. Small farms were struggling. Young people were leaving for cities with more opportunities. The communities that remained were often older, more insular, more resistant to change. Domestic violence in rural areas has always been both more hidden and more complicated than in urban settings. In a small town, you can't easily disappear into anonymity if you're trying to leave an abusive situation. Everyone knows your car, everyone knows where you work. Social services are limited. Shelters might be hours away. The isolation that makes rural life appealing for some makes it dangerous for others. Law enforcement in rural areas operates differently too. In Spencer, you're talking about a small-town police department with limited resources, and a county sheriff's office that covers a large geographic area with a small staff. Sophisticated forensic capabilities, the kind you see on TV crime shows, aren't readily available. Investigations depend heavily on witness statements, basic evidence collection, and the individual skills of whoever catches the case. The social fabric of communities like Spencer is tight, but also complicated. There are families who have been feuding for generations over land disputes or old grudges. There are alliances and loyalties that outsiders can't see but that influence everything. When a prominent local family is involved in a criminal matter, those dynamics become critically important. And then there's the timing. September 11, 2001, changed everything in America, including how law enforcement prioritized cases. In the days and weeks after the attacks, resources were redirected. Attention was elsewhere. A missing woman in rural New York, especially one whose husband claimed she'd left voluntarily, was not going to get the immediate intense focus it might have received at another time. This was the world Michele Harris was trying to navigate in the summer and fall of 2001. A small town where her estranged husband's family had influence. A community where leaving a marriage was complicated by everyone knowing everyone. A moment in history that was about to make her disappearance even easier to dismiss. The days before September 11th. The period leading up to Michelle's disappearance is marked by escalating tensions in the divorce proceedings. This wasn't a case where things were calming down or moving toward resolution. If anything, the situation was getting worse. In early September 2001, there were ongoing disputes about custody arrangements. Cal had the children living with him at the house. Michele was staying elsewhere but seeing the kids regularly. Court dates were approaching. Lawyers were involved. The divorce that had been dragging on was finally moving toward some kind of conclusion, and that meant decisions were going to be made about money, property, and custody. For Michele, this should have been a light at the end of the tunnel. Once the divorce was final, she could move on, build a new life. For Cal, according to some accounts, the divorce represented a threat. He would lose assets, lose control, lose his image as a family man. Whether he saw it that way is speculation, but the fact remains that he was fighting the divorce hard. Michele was working regular shifts at the village tavern. She needed the money, needed the routine, needed the social interaction. Service work became a lifeline for her during this period. It got her out of her own head, away from the stress of the divorce, into a space where she could just be Michele the waitress, good at her job, liked by customers. In the days immediately before September 11th, Michele was in contact with friends. She talked about the divorce, about seeing her kids, about making plans for the future. Nothing in these conversations suggested she was planning to disappear. No one later reported that she seemed suicidal or desperate, or like she was saying goodbye. She was stressed, yes, but she was also looking forward, making plans, fighting for what she wanted. The weekend before her disappearance, Michele had time with her children. By all accounts, these visits went normally. She was affectionate with her kids, engaged, present. There was no indication of a woman preparing to abandon her family. There were, however, tensions with Cal that were documented. Exchanges about the children were strained. Communication was minimal and hostile. Friends of Michele said she was increasingly frustrated with Cal's behavior during custody exchanges, his refusal to be flexible, his apparent determination to make everything as difficult as possible. On September 10, 2001, Michele went to work at the village tavern for the evening shift. This was routine for her. She'd work, make tips, chat with customers, then drive home late at night. That night, everything seemed normal. She served tables, talked to regulars, cleaned up at the end of her shift. Around 11:30 p.m., she clocked out and left. That was the last time anyone verifiably saw Michele Harris alive. The night she disappeared, September 10th into the early morning hours of September 11th, 2001. Michelle's shift ended around 11:30 p.m. The village tavern was in Owego, about 15 minutes from Spencer. This drive from the restaurant to the house she still technically shared with Cal was one Michele had made countless times. A simple, rural road. At that time of night, there would be almost no traffic. Michele drove a blue 1998 Mercury Tracer, a practical, nondescript car. According to later forensic examination, she drove from Owego to Spencer without incident. The route is straightforward. Back roads, a few turns, then to the Harris property on Morstan Road. The house on Morstan Road was isolated, not unusual for rural New York, but important to understand. This wasn't a neighborhood where houses are close together and neighbors notice unusual activity. The Harris property was set back from the road, surrounded by fields and trees. At night, it would be dark, quiet, the kind of place where something could happen and no one would see or hear. Michele pulled into the driveway sometime after midnight. Best estimates place her arrival between 12 a.m. and 12:30 a.m. on September 11th. She parked, and then something happened. This is where the facts become disputed, where theories diverge, where the case becomes about forensic evidence and competing narratives rather than clear answers. What is known for certain? Michele's car was found in the driveway the next morning. The driver's side door was open. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse was in the car. Her wallet was in the purse. Money was in the wallet. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. But Michele was gone. Cal Harris's account of that night would change slightly in different tellings, but the core story remained consistent. He claimed he never saw Michele that night. He said he was asleep in the house with the children. He said he had no idea Michele had come home. He said he woke up the next morning, saw her car in the driveway with the door open, and assumed she'd been there and left. This story has problems from the start. A car sitting in your driveway all night with the door open and the keys in the ignition, and you don't notice? You don't hear it pull up. You don't check on it? In a rural area where car theft is a real concern, you leave a vehicle sitting there all night and into the next day without investigating? But that was Cal's story, and he stuck to it. What Cal didn't report, what he didn't mention to anyone initially, was the blood in the driveway. Small drops, not immediately visible to a casual observer, but there. And when investigators finally processed the scene days later, they found those drops. Human blood type. When the towers fell, the morning of September 11, 2001, started like any other morning in Spencer. Cal would have gotten the kids up, gotten them ready for school. Michelle's car was in the driveway, door open, but Cal claimed he thought nothing of it. Then the world stopped. The first plane hit the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. By the time the second plane hit at 9:03 a.m., it was clear this wasn't an accident. America was under attack. For the rest of that day, and the days that followed, everything else ceased to matter. Television played the same horrific images on loop. People were glued to news coverage. The country went into a state of shock and mourning. Nothing felt important except what was happening in New York City, at the Pentagon, in that Pennsylvania field. In this context, Michele Harris's absence initially went largely unremarked upon. She wasn't at work that day, but with everything happening, no one immediately called to check on her. Her friends weren't surprised not to hear from her. Everyone was dealing with the attacks. Even her children at school that day wouldn't have thought it odd not to see their mother immediately given the chaos. It was Cal who first suggested Michele was missing, but not in the way you might expect. He didn't call the police in a panic. He didn't organize searches. Instead, according to later testimony, he told people Michele had left, just walked away, abandoned the family, used the chaos of September 11th to disappear and start a new life somewhere. This narrative is crucial because it shaped the initial response to Michelle's absence. If she'd left voluntarily, if she'd chosen to walk away, then there was no emergency. No reason for an immediate investigation, just a woman making a choice, however painful for those left behind. Michelle's friends didn't believe it. Her family didn't believe it. But in the confusion and trauma of that week, their concerns were initially dismissed or downplayed. Cal was the husband, the father of her children, the person with legal standing. His version of events carried weight. It wasn't until several days later, when Michele failed to contact anyone, when she didn't call her children, when she simply remained gone, that people began to seriously question Cal's story. And it wasn't until law enforcement finally started looking closely at the scene that the evidence began to tell a very different story than the one Cal had provided. The investigation begins. The Tioga County Sheriff's Office caught the case. In a county with limited resources and a small investigative staff, this was already a challenge, but the timing made it worse. Law enforcement across the country was stretched thin in mid-September 2001. Every agency was dealing with security concerns, watching for additional attacks, trying to maintain order in a traumatized nation. But Michelle's case couldn't be ignored forever. Too many people were asking questions. Too many inconsistencies were emerging in Cal's account. And there was that car, sitting in the driveway with the door open, that no one could adequately explain. When investigators finally processed the scene properly, days after Michelle's disappearance, they found the blood. Small drops in the driveway, near where Michelle's car had been parked. The blood was tested. It was human. It was consistent with Michelle's blood type. This changed everything. A woman disappearing voluntarily doesn't leave her blood in the driveway. This was now potentially a crime scene. Investigators began interviewing people systematically. They talked to Michelle's co-workers at the village tavern. They talked to her friends. They talked to family members. And they talked to Cal Harris multiple times. Cal's behavior during these interviews raised red flags for investigators. He seemed unconcerned about Michelle's disappearance. He continued to insist she had left voluntarily. When confronted with the blood evidence, he had explanations that investigators found unconvincing. Maybe she'd hurt herself and left anyway. Maybe the blood wasn't even hers. Maybe it had been there before that night and no one noticed. The investigation also revealed things about Cal that painted a concerning picture. There was documented history of the contentious divorce. There were statements from people who said Cal had made threatening comments about Michele. There were financial records showing that Cal stood to lose significant assets in the divorce settlement. Motive, in other words, was not hard to establish. The problem was evidence. Without a body, without witnesses, without clear forensic proof of what happened, building a murder case is extraordinarily difficult. The blood in the driveway suggested violence, but drops of blood don't prove murder. They don't prove who caused the bleeding or what happened after. Investigators worked the case methodically. They searched the Harris property multiple times. They brought in cadaver dogs. They interviewed hundreds of people. They looked at Cal's movements on the night Michele disappeared. They examined his vehicle for evidence. Some of what they found was suggestive, scratches on Cal's hands that he couldn't or wouldn't explain satisfactorily, inconsistencies in his timeline, witnesses who contradicted aspects of his story. But none of it was smoking gun evidence. The searches of the property and surrounding areas turned up nothing. No body, no clothes, no additional evidence. If Cal had killed Michele, he disposed of her remains thoroughly enough that repeated searches by experienced investigators couldn't find them. This became a pattern in the investigation. Suggestive evidence, concerning behavior, a strong motive, but no definitive proof. The kind of case that's frustrating for law enforcement, because you know something happened, you have a good idea who did it, but building a prosecutable case is a different matter. The prosecutor's dilemma. Tioga County District Attorney Jim Hayden faced a difficult decision. He had a missing woman, almost certainly dead. He had a husband with motive and opportunity. He had some physical evidence, but he didn't have a body. And prosecuting a murder case without a body is one of the most challenging things a prosecutor can attempt. Historically, no-body murder cases have a lower conviction rate than standard murder prosecutions. Juries are reluctant to convict someone of murder when there's no physical proof the victim is even dead. Defense attorneys can argue that the person left voluntarily, that they're in hiding, that they'll show up one day and prove the prosecution wrong. But Hayden decided to move forward. In 2007, 6 years after Michele disappeared, Calvin Harris was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The decision to prosecute was controversial. Some in law enforcement thought the case was too weak, that they should wait for more evidence. Others argued that if they didn't prosecute, Cal would never face justice, that waiting for a body that might never be found meant letting a killer go free. The legal proceedings that followed would become a textbook example of why no-body murder cases are so complex and why the American justice system sometimes produces seemingly contradictory results. The first trial. Calvin Harris's first trial began in 2007. The prosecution's case was circumstantial but substantial. They presented the blood evidence. They presented testimony from Michele's friends and family about her fear of Cal, about the contentious divorce. They presented financial records showing Cal's motive. They presented expert testimony about the pattern of evidence suggesting foul play. The defense countered with their central argument. You can't prove Michele is dead, therefore you can't prove my client killed her. They attacked the blood evidence as minimal and inconclusive. They presented character witnesses who said Cal was a good father, a businessman, not a murderer. They argued that Michele had every reason to disappear, to start over somewhere new. The jury deliberated, and they convicted Calvin Harris of second-degree murder. The conviction seemed to bring closure. Justice had been served. Michele's family could finally grieve properly, knowing that her killer had been held accountable. Cal was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But this wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning of a legal journey that would span decades and produce results that still seem impossible to reconcile. The appeal and retrial. Cal Harris's defense team appealed the conviction. They argued that there had been errors in the trial, that evidence had been improperly admitted or excluded, that the judge had made mistakes in instructing the jury. In 2009, an appellate court overturned the conviction. They found that there had been issues significant enough to warrant a new trial. Cal Harris, who had been in prison for 2 years, was suddenly eligible for bail while awaiting the retrial. The second trial took place in 2009. Same evidence, mostly same witnesses, but a different jury. The prosecution presented their case again. The defense presented their case again. Everyone waited to see if the second jury would reach the same conclusion as the first. They didn't. The second jury acquitted Calvin Harris. Let that sink in. The same man, the same evidence, but 2 different outcomes. First convicted, then acquitted. How is that possible? The answer lies in the nature of circumstantial evidence and the power of reasonable doubt. The second jury apparently felt that without a body, without definitive proof of death, they couldn't convict. The defense had successfully planted enough doubt about whether Michele was actually dead, whether the evidence proved Cal had killed her if she was dead, whether the prosecution's timeline made sense. Cal Harris walked free. Michele's family was devastated. The community was divided. Some believed justice had been served with the acquittal, that the prosecution had overreached. Others believed the killer had escaped accountability through legal technicalities. But the story still wasn't over. The second appeal. After Cal's acquittal in the second trial, the prosecution appealed. Not the verdict itself. You can't appeal an acquittal in the American system. But they appealed the dismissal of certain evidence and the handling of the case. Legal proceedings continued, dragging on year after year. In 2013, another appellate court made a stunning decision. They ruled that there had been errors in the second trial that had prejudiced the prosecution's case. They ordered a third trial. The same defendant, for the same crime, with the same evidence, would be tried a third time. This is extraordinarily rare in American jurisprudence. It speaks to how tangled the legal issues in this case had become. The third trial, in 2016, 15 years after Michele disappeared, Calvin Harris went on trial for the third time. By this point, memories had faded. Some witnesses had died or were unavailable. The world had changed dramatically since September 11, 2001. But the central facts of the case remained the same. Michele Harris disappeared. Blood was found in the driveway. Cal had motive and opportunity, and Michele's body had never been found. The third trial lasted weeks. The prosecution, now led by new district attorneys as Hayden had retired, presented a refined version of their case. They had learned from the previous trials, knew which arguments worked and which didn't. They brought in new expert witnesses to explain the blood evidence and what it meant. The defense continued their strategy: raise doubt, attack the evidence, argue that the state couldn't prove Michele was dead beyond a reasonable doubt. This time, the jury convicted Calvin Harris again. Second-degree murder, 25 years to life. Cal's supporters insisted he was innocent, that he was being persecuted by overzealous prosecutors. Michele's family finally felt that justice had been achieved, even if it had taken 3 trials and 15 years. But even this wasn't the end. The legal maze continues. After the third conviction, Cal Harris appealed again. His attorneys argued, as they had before, that there were errors in the trial, that the evidence didn't support a conviction, that their client was innocent. In 2019, an appellate court upheld the conviction. It seemed like the case might finally be over. Cal would serve his sentence. Michele's family could finally have peace. But Cal's legal team kept fighting. They filed additional appeals, argued that new evidence or new legal theories required reconsideration. As of 2005, Calvin Harris remains in prison, but the legal proceedings around his case continue in various forms. The evidence that haunts. Let's look carefully at what we actually know about Michele Harris's disappearance, separating confirmed facts from inference and speculation. Confirmed facts. Michele disappeared on the night of September 2001. Her car was found in the driveway of the home she shared with her estranged husband. The car door was open, keys in the ignition. Blood consistent with Michele's blood type was found in the driveway. Michele never contacted her children, her friends, or her family again. No financial activity occurred on her accounts after that night. No body has ever been found. Logical inferences. The blood suggests violence occurred. The open car door suggests Michele was interrupted or forced from her vehicle. The fact that she never contacted her children suggests she didn't leave voluntarily given her documented devotion to them. The timing of her disappearance, in the midst of contentious divorce proceedings, suggests a motive for Cal. What remains unknown? What exactly happened that night? Where Michele's body is, if she's dead, who else, if anyone, might have been involved? Whether there's evidence that was never found or has been lost.